and thank all of you very much. I know that most of you were expecting to see Ralph Segrist. I am not Ralph Segrist. He is actually home feeling very, very ill. I can assure you, for many reasons, he would much prefer to be here today. One of the main reasons he would like to be here is that he was really looking forward to talking with you about one of his favorite topics, and that is energy policy. We are fortunate because that has also become one of my favorite topics, and I really appreciate you letting me share with you some of our views. It's hard to believe that it was just a few weeks ago that we were all sitting poised on the edge of the fiscal cliff, waiting for Congress to act. One of the more challenging aspects of this time for us was trying to explain to our board of directors in Germany what was happening in Washington. If you think about how senseless it seemed to most of us, you can probably begin to imagine what it looked like to them. I kept looking for ways to explain it, make it rational. And I learned one thing that was very interesting that for me made it sensible. What I learned was just as we call a group of puppies a litter, and we call a group of geese a gaggle, I learned that a group of baboons is called a Congress. Finally, I had something that I could tell them in Germany that made some sense out of it. As you may know, in the fiscal cliff legislation were some provisions that are called extenders. One of these was the production tax credit, or PTC, which has played a very significant role in financing wind energy projects. Without the PTC extension, there would have been virtually no wind farms built in the USA in 2013. So I and Ralph and all of my colleagues in the wind industry were watching what was happening very closely. We also watched the election process very closely. Everyone knew that this election, as in some previous ones, in the words of someone not very far from this location, this election was, it's the economy, stupid. Nevertheless, for us, it was heartening to see that energy issues, and the wind industry in particular, formed part of the national discussion. And as Skip just mentioned, we saw that national discussion also included in the President's inaugural address. This is very rewarding, but we believe that that discussion needs to be much larger and much more significant. This speech is entitled Between Little Rock and a Hard Place. And that's not just because we thought it was a clever play on words, which we did, but because government policy needs to reflect our values, our priorities, and the decisions that establish policy are often the result of some difficult choices. It's popular now for politicians to talk about an all-of-the-above approach to energy, indicating that they want to encourage diversity in the use of our nation's resource. It is a laudable goal. It is one that we would encourage, but it's also a very easy phrase, and to actually turn it into reality requires thoughtful consideration and strategic and sometimes difficult decisions. Energy policy in particular requires attention to a broad array of complex factors. And I'd like to share with you some of our understanding as manufacturers of wind turbines of these complex factors and the choices that make sense to us. I believe that if I can help you to understand a bit more about the energy business, then you'll make better choices, and more important, you will encourage our legislators and our regulators to make better choices. As you know, I hope, Nordex is in the wind business. We manufacture large utility-scale wind turbines, each of which is capable of powering about 700 American homes. We're in this business because it's one that makes economic sense, usually, for us and for our shareholders. This wouldn't be a business if that were not true. The business that we're in is one that is generally regarded as good for the environment, and it's popular with most Americans. A recent study demonstrated both, well, it's more than bipartisan nature, it's actually tripartisan nature of the support for wind energy. 93% of Democrats, 81% independents, and 72% Republicans. Overall, 83% of American voters believed that the nation should rely more on wind for our energy source. We often tend to think that if something is good, it's balanced by a negative. Broccoli is good for us, but it tastes bad unless we dress it up with things that are not so good for us. So people often think that if wind energy is good, it must have a negative, and perhaps that negative is that it will cost much more. They're very surprised to discover that that is not the case, especially when you look at the full cost picture. The wind industry has made tremendous strides over the past few years, improving technology and reducing costs. So much so that if we were deciding today to invest in a new plant for electrical generation, wind would actually turn out to be one of our least expensive options. Admittedly, most of us rarely get a chance to purchase a new plant for electricity generation, but let's pretend for the purposes today that that's what we're going to be doing. I know this slide has a lot of information on it, and it can be a little bit confusing. What it does is compare the costs of different types of generation. You can see over on the left the various coal, clean coal, conventional coal costs. It moves through a variety of gas sources, arriving at the most important one, which is wind, of course, and then solar, geothermal, biomass, and hydro. The figures take account of the capital investment required to build the plant, the operations and maintenance costs, which are referred to in the chart as O&M, and the cost of fuel and the transmission investment. So if we were going to make our choice simply on the basis of cost, as shown on this chart, we would probably gravitate toward one of the natural gas options. But we might want to pay some attention to the colors which make up those cost elements. The green colored one is labeled variable O&M, including fuel. These are the costs that can change over the time of our investment. And as you can see, the green part is well over 2/3 of the cost for the various gas options. The green is also, you will note, essentially non-existent for wind. That's because with wind energy, once your turbines are installed, your fuel is free. While this chart provides a likely cost in 2016, it's a snapshot, we expect that our new plant investment, is going to last a minimum of about 25 years. So we have to wonder, do we want so much of our cost for that long a time to be a variable cost? We also might want to rethink that decision about natural gas if we look at the records on natural gas pricing. That's very much a roller coaster ride, as you can see. And this is the last 10 years, and we have one price point that's almost 5 times higher than what we have at our current price point. Our current pricing tends to be the lowest that it has ever been in the history of natural gas. In fact, experts regard recent natural gas pricing as unsustainably low, and we've already seen that it's begun to climb. The financial markets can provide some level of protection for us on the price of gas for the future if we want to take advantage of it. We can purchase a hedge for about $20 per megawatt hour to guarantee our price for 10 years. What we see on this is a range. I don't know if it looks blue or gray, but it was supposed to look blue. We have a band where wind, using current prices and technology, is essentially competitive with gas pricing. We see the floating and moving gas price and the number where it's at for 2016. Now, I said to you that wind was pretty competitive, and it doesn't actually look like it here. But if we look at taking in that hedge price, that 10-year hedge adds to the price of gas. So to provide that same certainty, suddenly you see that we've moved the gas pricing right into that band where wind becomes competitive. The wind pricing, don't forget, is guaranteed for 20 to 25 years, not just the 10 years that we've been able to purchase for our hedge. So with natural gas, we still don't know what the cost of our fuel is going to be for 2023 to 2033. So when we're thinking about energy policy, one of the choices we have to make is whether we make decisions that we're going to have to live with for 25 years or more based on what is cheapest right now, right this minute, or whether we consider the longer-term costs in our evaluation. One question that is often raised with regard to wind as an energy source is how effective it can be when, as we know, it doesn't blow all the time, not even in Chicago, the Windy City, where I'm from. All the comparison numbers that we've been looking at include the fact that wind is what is called an intermittent resource, and they take into account the fact that the wind turbines are not always producing energy. In fact, the intermittent nature of wind has actually turned out to be one of its advantages when it's part of a utility's resource portfolio. When the wind turbines are generating electricity, utilities can cut back on more expensive fuel sources. In fact, there's increasing evidence around the country of the positive impact of wind on consumer electric bills. And you can see that this is especially true when we have utilities that are claiming and complaining that the cost of wind has driven down the pricing and therefore their profits on conventionally generated electricity. We've been focusing on the cost of energy so far because I've wanted you to feel comfortable with the cost of wind in particular. But there are obviously other considerations that need to go into our decision of what type of generating plant we want to build. Energy is as critical to our national well-being as food is to our individual health and survival. Just as we demand that our food supply be secure and safe, we require the same of our energy supply. Ask those who suffered the extended power outages following Hurricane Sandy. Just as we require different types of foods to function and keep our bodies healthy, the vitality of our national energy system also requires diversity for optimal health. Previously, I referred to a utility's portfolio of resources. And the word portfolio is an interesting one because we tend to think of an investment portfolio, for example. And it's no different. It seems that the concept of diversity within a portfolio, whether it's our own retirement investments or investments in our country's energy, diversity is what provides a sense of stability, security, and reduces risk. Today, our electricity is supplied overwhelmingly by fossil fuels. That totals 86%, with the renewable group coming in between 5 and 6%. These fossil fuels have brought us to where we are as a nation. They have enabled us to create a middle class, to benefit from almost endless improvements to our daily life in farming the land, producing food, doing laundry, and our mobility and telecommunications and automation. Without fossil fuels, where we are today would not have been possible. For Americans, one element of our security where electricity is concerned is knowing that when we walk into a room, flip a switch, the lights will come on. The comfort that the supply that we have will actually meet our needs. Fossil fuels, whether oil, gas, coal, uranium, all are finite resources. Today, we consume in a single day what has taken tens of thousands of years to form. The laws of supply and demand dictate that as the imbalance continues, the price of oil will surely rise, making it no longer viable for our purposes. At that time, clearly a substitute will be needed from both a security and an economic perspective. So going back to our consideration of what type of electrical generating plant we want to build, where continuity of supply is concerned, we might want to take into account both risk and, again, the longer term. Whether because of cost or availability, we know that eventually we will have to change the way things are being done. Transformation will have to come, and the later that we wait to start to invest in the future, the more expensive it gets and the more difficult and challenging it will be. Again, our policy question is whether we continue to choose the same old thing or whether we look to the future and prepare for what lies ahead. Given the importance of energy to our country, we need to look at the security of our energy supplies in the same way that we look at other issues of national security. There are some things that are just too important for us to delegate to other countries. The United States is blessed with an abundant wind resource. It's one of the best in the world. By tapping into this homegrown and inexhaustible source of energy, we can continue to reduce our reliance on foreign oil and gas. Our security also demands that our energy supply be robust and diversified geographically. If disaster, natural or otherwise, occurs in one location, do we have enough resources in enough different places in terms of both equipment and fuel to compensate for it? You can see in this map the distribution of wind farms across the United States. The 2012 map is not yet available, but I can tell you that while the pattern of wind farm location is not dramatically different, the numbers for 2012 tend to indicate that about 12.5 gigawatts of wind has entered the country's portfolio over the past year. A lot of this wind farm location and growth has been driven by state renewable energy standards, or sometimes clean energy standards, as it may be that we will be seeing in Arkansas soon. As the business has grown over the last few years, it's also brought a new manufacturing industry with it. More than 400 facilities across the country producing components. And if I can point proudly to the red spot in northeast Arkansas, that's our plant in Jonesboro. But these investments, these plants producing components all across the country, have created thousands and thousands of highly skilled jobs, and the industry has poured millions into rural America in the form of payments and tax revenues from the local wind farms. Earlier I mentioned that the vast majority of Americans believe that wind power is a good thing. They want to see more of it as an energy source. For many, this preference is driven by a concern for safety and the environment. As a people, we tend to recycle. We choose grocery bags based on their ultimate impact on our environment. We select Energy Star appliances. We insulate our homes. We devote resources to cleaning up the air and water. We buy hybrid cars. We try to reduce our carbon footprints. And we make a myriad of choices every day to make our actions match our beliefs. Essentially, we each operate our own personal energy policy, reflecting as much as possible our values and priorities. We want our country and our government to do the same. In just the last couple of years, we have seen and experienced horrifying human and environmental disasters, oil spills in the Gulf, mine explosions and collapses in Chile, China, West Virginia, and the Fukushima nuclear meltdown in Japan. All of these linked to the fuels that we choose to power our lives. For at least 83% of us, we want our choices to include fuels that are safe for our neighborhoods, safe for our families, our children and grandchildren, and for the earth on which we all live. Our decisions on all of these elements taken together form the basis of an energy policy, defining the values and the priorities that should be taken into account, whether we here today are choosing a new plant to generate electricity, or whether the United States is pursuing an all-of-the-above energy strategy. We can summarize them this way. That's supposed to say toward an energy policy. Oh, portfolio diversity. We want fuel sources that are both renewable and conventional. We want to have both intermittent and base load so that we can take advantage of price advantages either way. We need them to be geographically dispersed. We want our economic element to be cost effective. What we pay every single month for our energy, we don't want it to cost an unreasonable amount. We want to make sure that our portfolio includes some long-term stability. We also want to be able to take advantage of those short-term spot market opportunities when they exist and when they're more favorable. And we want there to be a calculation that takes account of the total investment, not just right this minute today. In terms of security, we'd much prefer domestic rather than foreign. We want the acquisition or extraction of the fuel to be one that is safe and secure. And we want environmentally safe deployment. Unfortunately, the United States does not have an energy policy. And as a consequence, we don't have a framework for making decisions or incorporating these kinds of priorities into our energy picture today. The rules we use to govern energy are a complex and unrelated patchwork of tax, environmental, and financial regulations. Some are federal, some are state, some are local. The result is an uneven playing field, which in many ways works to the disadvantage of renewables, including wind. I'd like to share a few examples with you to explain why and how this is the case. incentives. Government subsidies for the fossil fuel industries have been in place for more than 90 years now. They are permanently written into the tax code. Even now, these older, very well-established oil and gas businesses continue to receive support at a rate 5 times greater than that provided to renewables. For renewables, the main element is that production tax credit that I referred to at the start, and another form, which is the investment tax credit, both of which are credits that are applied only once energy is being produced. These numbers, though, don't even tell the whole story of the taxpayer support for these industries. They don't take into account the legal liability limitations which the government has established to protect oil and gas and other similar investments. The exposure of companies operating nuclear power plants is limited to $10 billion for a nuclear accident. The legal liability for economic damages caused by an oil spill such as the one in the Gulf of Mexico is $75 million. The numbers don't include the billions of dollars that the government guarantees to build nuclear power plants and make them financeable, nor do they include the cost of nuclear waste disposal. It doesn't include the actual cost of an accident such as the one in Chernobyl or in Fukushima. The total cost and damage, just for comparison's sake, the total cost and damage resulting from Fukushima is estimated to include more than $60 billion. And that's not counting the actual earthquake and tsunami damages. That's just the Fukushima nuclear portion of it. The value of these taxpayer-funded or indirect or non-monetary subsidies is very substantial for those industries. Another area where there is an uneven playing field is permitting. For the wind industry, the permitting process is quite extensive and requires, among other things, a comprehensive and lengthy environmental impact assessment study. This typically costs about $2 million per wind farm. It includes geological studies, studies for the protection of endangered species, such as birds and bats, studies related to the protection of and mitigation of cutting of any trees, studies for sewage and groundwater control. One area of concern, for example, is the Indiana bat, which is an endangered species which is present in 13 states from the East Coast through Indiana and into Illinois. Over the past many years, there's only one single Indiana bat that was killed by a wind farm, and that one was in Indiana. However, thousands are killed every year in road traffic. And this protected species is also present in areas along the East Coast where coal mining involves removing the tops of mountains by blasting and then digging out the coal. These far more destructive activities take place without attention to the harm to the bat habitats or even active bat caves. In fact, one of our wind farms in Maryland is on just such a former coal mining site. And you can see the Nordex, the beautiful Nordex wind turbines along the ridge line, and you can see what used to be the top of a mountain that is now a disused coal mine, and it's just left that way. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't apply rigid environmental standards to the development and operation of wind farms. We should. However, they must equally be applied to conventional energy. Blanket permits filled out by oil and gas companies themselves to permit the offshore oil drilling versus a 3-year environmental study costing $1 to $2 million for a wind project just does not put the two operations on a parity. All projects should have to comply with environmental laws and standards. Another area is utility resource planning and evaluation. Utilities in different states operate under different rules. I spoke earlier about the intermittent nature of wind. It may surprise you to learn that in some places, when utilities prepare their forward plans, they add the cost of a new gas turbine to the cost of a wind turbine, rather than assuming that wind will be an addition to their existing plants. Their theory is wind is intermittent, therefore another source of energy is required. In truth, all plants shut down for some period of time. They shut down for cleaning, maintenance. Remember that O&M, operations and maintenance? Retrofitting, upgrading. But the utilities do not assume that every time they construct one plant, they need to construct a second. This would be like, suppose you need to buy a second car for your family. You already have the big SUV, which accommodates mom, dad, the kids' friends, and the dog. You're now thinking a small 4-seater economy car would be just what would make sense in the context of your family. Using the utility evaluation approach, you could not buy that small economy 4-seater car without also buying a second SUV, because that 4-seater won't accommodate everybody all the time, and ignoring the fact that you already have that big SUV. It won't surprise you to know that using this approach, wind turns out to be far more expensive and uncompetitive. Using this approach, you also won't end up with your small economy 4-seater car for your family. Some states require that utilities choose the least costly resource. This sounds quite sensible and obviously in the public interest, until you think back to that first slide that we looked at, comparing the costs of different types of generation. Do we define cost as today, just this minute? Or do we ask that our utilities operate using a balanced portfolio that includes some fuels with long-term guaranteed pricing, like wind? If we agree that an all-of-the-above approach is in the best interests of the United States, then the choices that form the above have to be on roughly equal ground in terms of their competitiveness. Currently, it looks more like this. All of the above, not so much. It's time to make the hard decisions that will deliver to America an energy policy that works and that reflects the values and the priorities of this country. We need to include renewable energy sources. We want it to be economically balanced to protect our risks and keep our costs down. We want it to be domestic and robust. And we want it to be safe and secure. And that's an all of the above that makes sense. Winston Churchill, whose mother was American, famously said, "The United States will always do the right thing when all other possibilities have been exhausted." For me, for at least 83% of my countrymen and women, we know what the right thing is, and now it's the time to do it. I appreciate your attention and your interest today, and now I'm interested to hear how it all sounds to you and what you think.
Thank you so much for that. We do have time for some questions.
Thank you.
raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. We'll start over here. One second. Maybe we can get a microphone for you.
I have a question for you, and it's something that I believe is extremely important, and that is the water that is used to extract through fracking gas and oil, and the fact that something like the Hoover Dam has now been reduced to 25%,
Right.
and they figure within the next 10 years might not be able to produce hydroelectric power. The fact that we have 27,000 abandoned oil rigs setting in the Gulf of Mexico alone, over 100,000 in the world abandoned leaking, of which we are not addressing now. I sat right across the river in 1979 from 3 Mile Island.
Mm-hmm.
I watched that area, and I watched the government dump over 40,000 gallons of radioactive waste into the Susquehanna River. It is not a safe, viable form of energy. We have no way to dispose of it. The one thing with wind turbines that is interesting, you are not utilizing life-sustaining water. You are not dumping toxic waste. It is renewable. I thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Hi. I read an article this morning that I hope you'll make a happy correction to one of your stats. It's actually said that new numbers showed 13.2 gigawatts of wind power installed last year. You know,
Even
a record
better.
year, right? A big rush at the end
Yes.
with PTC. I want to talk about the issue of costs versus other fuel sources that you mentioned. It seems like that one of the things that's really been driving the ability of the fossil fuel industry to talk about, hey, we're the cheapest form of electricity, is that they don't play by the same rules as everybody else. And there seems to have been a push over the last 4 years, especially through EPA regs, especially for clean air and clean water, to kind of make the fossil fuel industry internalize those costs that they've externalized on us for water and air and health costs and those kind of things. How much of that do you think is driving this resurgence of the wind industry, or really, I don't know if resurgence is the right word, but a really good record year? Is that a big part of why people are turning more towards wind, because it's actually driving up the cost of fossil fuels?
I don't think we've seen the impact of EPA regulation yet on the utilities in general. I know that for coal in particular, those additional costs are going to make it, and if we look back, let me see if I can do that. Oh, don't you love the technology? If we look back, coal was already heading toward uncompetitive, and the additional EPA costs that will be applied for scrubbers and filtering, all that type of activity, is going to make coal in particular less and less attractive. I don't think that it's been the driver for the growth that we've seen. I think the driver has much more been either the state renewable standards, which have encouraged many states and utilities to diversify their portfolio, and the availability of the financial structures for the wind industry that allow it to compete.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I was thinking, has any thought been given to the issue of a power storage, wind-driven power storage? It would seem that would be an ideal thing on a small scale, that you could do that with wind, but you couldn't do it as easily with other forms of energy.
I am certainly aware of quite a number of efforts that have gone into how do we store wind, because that would be a wonderful thing. One of my favorite stories, actually, is from one of my colleagues who said, we already have a device to store energy from wind. It's called the electric car. If you plugged it in at night and used wind energy when it is most available at night to power that electricity, it goes into the storage battery of the car, And now we've had a storage mechanism for wind energy. I like that idea, but it's not something that's actually viable. And the numbers, when people have looked at it, it's going to take us a long time to get enough electric cars out there to make that actually make a difference. But there is absolutely research that is going on in many locations looking at cost-effective and effective ways of storing wind.
Over here.
Hi. I saw on your map that Arkansas was white. Is there any potential for Arkansas to be a wind energy place?
It's interesting that you should mention that. I know that the Arkansas Economic Development Corporation, and J.D. Lowry can probably tell you a bit more about it than I, commissioned some work to look at Arkansas as a wind producer. And actually, if you'll allow me to move forward again through the very, very slow, I did add to the back of my presentation, just in case this question came up. This is a study that was done that looked at wind energy in the southeast. And I'm sorry, these things turn out to be very small on the slides. Arkansas, with the nice big green and the blue, the only ones that you can almost actually see, that is the Arkansas wind potential when it is tested on an 80-meter hub height, because the higher you go with a wind turbine, the wind resource is better. Up to 9 gigawatts of wind is available in Arkansas, up to 50 gigawatts if you go on to a 100-meter hub. And the gigawatt hours, the amount of energy that would be available from these, could actually cover 58% of Arkansas's current demand. Now, there are particular places in Arkansas where the wind resource is best. Having talked about permitting and some of the work that goes into evaluating wind resource, some of the best wind places are also places that would not work well for other permitting reasons. But we believe and have seen in the numbers from the AEDC study that there are opportunities for Arkansas to be a wind-producing state. Particularly, I mentioned that technology has changed for wind turbines. Our newest wind turbine, for example, is specifically designed for light wind conditions, which means that locations that previously were not economic now can be. So pretty soon you might have some beautiful wind turbines to look at.
Naomi, Ken Smith.
Hi, Ken.
A comment and a question to you. The battery storage, I had a chance to look at a wind field in Hawaii last year, one by HECO.
Why didn't you take me with you?
Yeah, that's been great, where they were working with battery storage as a companion storage device. They were having some problems with fires, so there's still some technology issues that they're developing, but we're starting to see more and more of that. Well, a question to you, though. There's been some articles in the literature lately about some of the wear and tear on turbines that they're starting to see out in the Midwest area. Do you have any comments regarding that? They're forecasting some increased maintenance costs of those turbines. Is any of that ringing a bell with you?
I believe I saw some of those articles. I know that none of them referred to Nordex turbines.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I also know that technology has changed. There have been improvements. Some of the older turbines undoubtedly were not made with the same attention to detail and quality control that others are. The other element that I think is important is, depending on who supplies the wind turbine, Nordex, for example, companies will typically purchase upfront their operations and maintenance agreement, their service agreement. And so it won't change. That for Nordex wind turbines and for many of our competitors also, that variable element still won't change.
We'll stay at this table, these two. You can go first.
Thank you. Lovely talk. And I've been interested in wind power for a long time. Most things succeed if people make money off of them. I bought some stock 15 to 20 years ago that I lost all the money from. I haven't bought any now because I don't know how to evaluate the company. So you mentioned your parent company is in Germany,
Yes.
but you're sold on the New York Stock Exchange?
No, we're actually
No?
listed on the Frankfurt Stock Exchange.
Okay. Well, the question is still relevant. Is there any protection in the policy we're trying to develop for investors in these companies? Because you need them, but they need at least to break even on them. And I think many, like me, have not done so. Now, you understand this is a very small purchase. It didn't break or make a company, but it's relevant.
It's obviously very difficult to, if anybody can give you any guarantees on stock market, let's grab them. One thing I can tell you about Nordex that might be of interest to you, our largest shareholder is also the largest shareholder in BMW. I think they consider both to be a high quality, good investment. So.
Yes,
From a general overview of what you've told us, it seems that wind energy will have a very difficult time meeting all the needs of America's energy crisis needs. And wind turbines take up a large amount of land. So is there,
See, now that's one of those statements that seems to be true, but actually turns out not to be true. Let me give you a little bit more information on that. If you remember the picture of our wind farm in Maryland next to the coal mine, you saw that the wind turbines were in a line. Although wind farm developers secure rights to many, many thousands of acres of land from farmers, ranchers, wherever they might be placing the wind farm, the actual usage level for a wind farm is less than 5% of a farmer's land. Those wind turbines go in, I should have brought more photos. Those wind turbines go in, the cows walk past, the hay is grown, the farmer does his work all around it. It is very land efficient for the extra income that is provided to the farmer and to the community. And 95% of their land goes on doing exactly what it was doing before.
If you were to eliminate all the subsidies for renewables and put across a carbon tax, how much would that be? I mean, you never hear a number.
You know those baboons in Washington? They're the ones who can figure out some of those. And I know that we look at a variety of different types of policy instruments, carbon taxes, renewable standards, other ways of trying to equalize it. There are also some who are proposing water use taxes, getting to the point of our first question. I don't know what the magic number is, nor do I know what the political will, although I can kind of guess at the political will in Washington right now for a carbon tax. But that is one of the many instruments that I know people have looked at as a way of bringing in an energy policy. But again, if we end up as a country with just this patchwork of taxes and regulation and without an overall goal, what you give with one hand, you take away with the other, and perhaps it doesn't end up producing overall the picture and the landscape that we actually want to see reflected in our energy policy. Sometimes it seems, we all know the story about if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And sometimes when I think about Washington, it feels like the only tool that they feel they have available is tax. And so it ends up being used to try to incentivize or punish rather than saying, let's set forward our goal, the policy to match it, and then the strategy to implement it, the legislation to make it happen.
We have time for one more.
One of the things you mentioned, Pat Hayes used to be mayor over in North Little Rock and had an opportunity to deal with the utility. We're the largest public power city in Arkansas, so we follow along with a lot of what you said. One of the interesting things that you commented on a little earlier was how you're from the Windy City, and maybe it's not quite as windy, perhaps, as it once was. If I misheard that, what my premise is that, how involved is not necessarily the industry, but in siting your wind farms, how involved and or how concerned are they about a certain area because of climate change having radical changes in their historical weather patterns that might affect the projection of wind generation over the lifetime of the plant? So is there much involvement in the forecasting for future vis-a-vis climate change in terms of siting of wind plants?
Before a wind farm project gets to the point that our potential customer turns to Nordex and our competitors and says, we want to do this wind farm, what would it take to put some of your beautiful turbines here? They go through years, at least 1 year, and often many more, of metrological testing. They put out met masts, as they're called, and test the speed of the wind, the consistency, the direction, all sorts of things. We employ wind and site engineers in Nordex to look at plans and siting and forecasting. Just as weather forecasters now have many, many more tools to predict what weather we're going to have, although I sometimes wonder about that. But the tools available for forecasting wind are pretty extensive. One of the interesting things when you talk about changes in wind, and I mentioned Hurricane Sandy, the wind industry looked very, very carefully at what happened with Hurricane Sandy. Not a single wind turbine came down during hurricane strength winds. So we thought that was a pretty good thing too.
Well, Naomi, thank you so much for filling in for Ralph today. Thank all y'all for coming out today.
Thank you.